All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Erin Nuccio. We're at Evesham Wood in Salem. It's June 30th, 2020. Erin, thanks so much for joining us today. First question for you is, why wine?
Let's see, I fell into wine right after college. This was mid-90s back on the East Coast. Northern Virginia, and not quite sure what I wanted to do with my life. Finished college in sociology, and was really into food and cooking, and thought about culinary school. And while pondering that, started working at a wine shop, which turned out to be a great wine shop. Started off sort of a cheesemonger in the cheese department, quickly caught the bug, got into wine, had some great mentors that really took me under their wing, taught me how to taste. And so within a year or so, I was part of the buying team there, and so I continued on with the retail side of the business for about 4 or 5 years in Northern Virginia. And I always joke, I learned what a lychee nut tasted like by tasting with my mentors and tasting Gewürztraminers, and then pointing that note out to me. And so I found out what a lychee nut tasted like before I'd ever eaten a lychee nut. But so we did about 5 years in Northern Virginia, and then unplanned, quickly fell in love with my now wife Jordan, who was on her way to veterinary school up in Massachusetts. So I made the decision to head up there with her, and decided to switch sides of the business, and did the distribution side of the business up there in Massachusetts for about 4 years. And she finished up veterinary school, and our family had sort of moved around. We were sort of this new start period of our life. We'd gotten married during vet school, and sort of thought, okay, where would we like to live? Where would she like to eventually open a veterinary practice? I was thinking I really wanted to get back into the retail side of the business, which I really loved and was really interested in organic, and I guess at the time I would call it natural wine, which has sort of taken on a different meaning now. And so I was drawn to the Pacific Northwest. My wife actually did her last externship was at a wildlife clinic up in outside of Seattle. So we spent our last few months of her vet school living in Seattle, and still really focused then on retail side of the business, not at all thinking about figuring out how to grow or make wine. And she was not so keen on the Northwest weather. So we did have family down in LA. We sort of got in the car, did a road trip from Seattle down to LA, stopping along the way, thinking, okay, where would we like to live? Where could she start a vet practice? Where could I start a retail? And we wound up compromising on Berkeley, California. So we moved there in, this was probably 2005. And sort of in that period, made the switch to trying to figure out how to make wine. My wife sort of, obviously knew I was very passionate about wine, but also when she was in vet school with quite busy, I would spend a lot of time in the garden, and wound up getting really into, had a big vegetable garden there. Super into that. She's looking at me doing that and wine and thinking, well, why don't you just, make wine and grow it? I said, it's great. It's totally different. I have no idea. Just because I can grow tomatoes and just because I can taste and assess wine doesn't mean I can make it. But she finally kept pushing on me, and I decided to figure out how to make it. And actually, first I tried to get into the Shemeketa online intro course. I was a little late in the semester, and gosh, I think it was Al McDonald. He wouldn't let me join. He said it was too late. I said, oh, no, I did not care about a grade. You know, I just want to listen in on it. He wouldn't let me. But so I missed that first semester. We're settling into Berkeley. And I decided to start studying in Napa and Sonoma. And so I really, I decided if I was going to make wine in the U.S., I really wanted to make it in the Willamette Valley. Just the Pinot Noir, the balance achieved in this region is really what I was drawn to. If you opened up the world, there are definitely old world regions that I'd love to, but the idea of moving to another country, learning a new language, trying to start a business seemed quite overwhelming. And the style of wine I was interested in was just really, I felt really hard to achieve in the California climate, you know, no matter where you were in California. I mean, nowadays I think, gosh, that would have been a real challenge, and maybe that would have been interesting to try and, you know, achieve that balance in that climate, but I don't know, either didn't seem possible or overwhelming at that point. But I still couldn't convince my wife to deal with the rain up in the Northwest, so I sort of put my head down and wound up going to school at Napa Valley College and focusing a little bit of vineyard there, but mostly winemaking, which was a really great experience. Sort of, I mean, they had a fully functioning, nice winery there, small vineyard, great professor, and we kind of learned everything you could do to wine. Which was kind of the opposite of my philosophy, but wound up being a great experience. You know, when we were sort of doing trials in class of acid additions or, you know, all the different additions, you know, my hand was always up with the one preferring the unaltered wine, usually the lone person in class, but by, you know, sort of having that opinion and having to defend it, really was a great experience for me, and really, you know, learning all the possible things you can do to wine, well, it wasn't my philosophy, was really beneficial. And really great people there. And then simultaneously I started taking classes at Santa Rosa Junior College, really focusing on the vineyard there. And they still have now, I think they have a winery, but they had a large vineyard there in the Russian River Valley. And about a 10-acre block of Pinot Noir that was organically farmed. And so I got in with the sort of farm manager there and started working in the vineyard there with the crew. We do that a couple days a week. And you know, different than growing vines up here in the valley, but great experience and really, you know, getting dirty in the vineyard with the crew. And so that was, I don't know, about a year into that, we were in, so this is probably spring of 2007, and we'd still living in Berkeley, and my wife's like, you know, gosh, they just said we've gone through 45 straight days of rain. I didn't even notice it. And so I had a little light bulb go off, like, okay, well, maybe it's time for the Northwest, give that a try. And so she was on board. So we were renovating a house there. I was literally screwing in the last doorknob. The animals were packed, the cars were packed, and we headed up to the Willamette Valley. And so that was spring, May of 2007. Prior to that, a couple months before, my mom had called me, said, oh, you know, this guy, I know this guy, friend of a friend, he's got something to do with Willamette Valley wine. You might want to get in touch with him. He's down in San Francisco, where I was in the Bay Area. And so So I thought, probably not going to lead to anything, but I'll, make contact. We went and had lunch, met him at the Slanted Door, a couple of bottles of wine later. We really hit it off. Great guy. Turned out he was CEO of a biotech company, but decades earlier had been one of the original investors of Evesham Wood. And he'd kind of had a falling out with Russ and Mary, but just had wonderful things to say about them, and of course, amazing wines, and said, "Oh, you should get in touch when you get up there." So I did. When we got up here, I emailed Russ, and my goal was to sort of work for someone as an assistant for a couple of years while looking for land, to sort of start a vineyard and estate. And so I emailed Russ asking him for a job. He said, "No, I don't have a job for you, but you can come out and check out the vineyard and the winery." So I came out, it was probably May, June of 2007, and met Russ. First time I'd been to Evesham, and wound up spending half the day with him. Just really hit it off. Very similar philosophies, great guy. And at the end of the day, I asked him again for a job. He said no, but you can come work harvest if you want. So I thought, I really was looking for that assistant position, or at least to get in there. But thought, the opportunity to work with Russ is something I really should do. So I did the first harvest here in 2007. And while we were getting close to that, Russ said, "Oh, if you want to make some of your own wine, you can make some in the warehouse." So I jumped at that opportunity. And actually, another family friend, Ken Cancilla, had come out, close to a decade before. He was in a running group with my mom back in Northern Virginia. But he was a tech guy and came out here. Intel, bought an old Christmas tree farm. He actually used to see Pierre Ravani, he used to write for The Advocate back in MacArthur's in DC, and talked about coming out and growing grapes out here. So he did that. My wife Jordan and I had actually seen him in 2005 on our trip down from Seattle to LA. We stopped and stayed with him for a little while and actually helped him plant some of his vines on his hillside. Again, no idea that I would be making wine at that point. But so when Russ said you can make some wine, he was the first guy I went to find some grapes. His Cancilla vineyard is up just over the Yamhill-Carlton border by Cherry Grove. And he didn't have anything available. He said, "Oh, you should talk to Mumtazi's." So I talked to Mo and got a few tons of biodynamic fruit from him. I rented a U-Haul truck and went and picked those up. Definitely overloaded the truck. I remember driving from his place in McMinnville back down here to the winery, and this was 2007, and so the rains were there. It started sprinkling on my drive. I go faster, just trying to beat this rain, and stressed. This is my first wine ever making, and on my own. And the grapes got here safely, but it was definitely a interesting and, in retrospect, great first vintage here in the valley. I remember Russ had tarps out over fruit outside the crush pad, and inches of rain collecting on them. So it was a challenge, but certainly made amazing wines that year. It took a while for some people, particularly the press, to catch on to that, but really special vintage. And so that was 2007 harvest. Great experience. Russ didn't have a job for me. It became super clear. Just really small operation here. And so I thought, my my plan, I need to go get that assistant winemaking job. And so went out and started networking some more, and through a friend of a friend, got in touch with Jay Summers, and I started helping him out at his winery. He would come pick me up. I lived in Portland, right down the road from him actually. He'd come pick me up in the morning, drive to the winery, and talk about the valley and Russ, and Jay always had really great things to say about Russ and his wines. And sort of through that experience, I kind of realized, this opportunity to work with Russ was something I just couldn't pass up. And so, I don't know, December, January, something like that of that year, I decided, Russ, an invitation for me to come back, so I decided I was gonna come back next year, work harvest, make some more wine of my own. The warehouse where I made the wine, Haden Fig, which later became Haden Fig for 8-9 years, was a pole barn where Russ would store bottled wine. No drains, no water. We had a little heater and a little wall air conditioning unit. I used to have to put up plastic up to cover the cased wines when I was fermenting in there, so things wouldn't splash and get on the bottled wine. But it was bonded space, and it was enough climate control. And to me, it was a great opportunity. And so that first year, 07, I made a couple tons. 08, got up to 500-600 cases. And Russ and Mary and I just became friends. I mean, it was a little awkward at first. Evesham wasn't open to the public, and so I would be coming to their house to come check on my wine every week. But they were super welcoming and very hospitable. Was more awkward on my part. And so I kept doing that for a few years, and still looking for land. Russ and I would go out, drive in the valley, almost all Yosemite Hills, but sort of looking at spots where he thought would be great potential vineyard sites. And a couple things got sort of close, but never found the perfect site. And I kind of felt like I was could be wearing out my welcome here. I was making, at that point, we were up to 2,000-3,000 cases in this little warehouse with no drains. And so I'd actually contacted Brad Ford over at Illahee Vineyard. He and I became acquainted, and he was doing some alternating proprieting there, and so I was planning to make the next vintage that would have been 2010 wines at Illahee, which I was, disappointed, saddened to leave Evesham, but really felt it was time, and I wasn't ready to start my own, to build my own winery. Hadn't found the land yet, so and that was going to be a great place just to change. And then Russ and Mary kind of surprisingly asked to meet with me, which was the first time ever, very informal. And so I kind of came and sat down, and I think, gosh, are they going to ask me to take over the winemaking or something? This is weird. And they asked me to buy Evesham Wood, which was pretty shocking. And I was certainly flattered, but also pretty clear it was not what I wanted to do. And I had no idea Russ and Mary were looking to move on. And what was important to them really was passing on Evesham. They weren't looking to, cash out. They were looking to, take this place into the next few decades. And so I took a little time to think about it, but nothing really changed with me. It was, not my plan. I really wanted to do my own thing. I really wanted to build my own in sort of all aspects: vineyard, winery, brand, philosophy. And so I kept, coming by every week or so, making my wines, stayed good friends with them, would sort of nudge Russ to push up his asking price and he could get more. And they'd had, they never made it public, and they had a couple opportunities that came that thought there might be people to come take it over, but those sort of kept falling through. And so after, 6-9 months or so, for some reason I just kind of came back to it, and it kind of clicked to me that I was the person to take Evesham, to the next generation, and really felt a real responsibility that someone needed to do that. This place was so special, and it deserved to be sort of shepherded to the next phase, and there was no one better to do that than me. Which I loved Evesham, loved everything about it, but again wasn't excited about that prospect of just sort of shepherding rather than creating. But I'd had some good early success with Haden Fig, and that started to click too, realizing, well, I could keep Haden Fig going, and that's my own, and that's something that could be all me, while Evesham, part of why I really didn't want to take it over was because in my mind it was sort of as good as it gets. There's nothing I could add to this place. There's nothing I could do to make it better. The best success I could have would be to not screw it up, which is a big challenge, but not the sort of excitement I was looking for. But then I realized I had Haden Fig, and that might meet some of those needs of mine. So I decided, emailed Russ out of the blue one night and said, I think I should do this. He was surprised. He was sort of taken off guard. And said, okay, I was out of town, let's get together when I get back in town and talk. It's okay. Well, I just sent a letter off to Alan Meadows of Berghound, asking if he knew of anyone that might be interested in taking over Evesham. So I'll email him and tell him not to open that letter. So he did that. We got together, and there was not much to discuss. And we got that ball rolling. And there was legal sort of technical stuff that wasn't fun. But we closed on mid-August of 2010. And the day before, I was here. Miguel, Fredo, and Isaro, three Torres brothers who, Miguel been here since he was a kid. Russ taught him English. They've been here a long time. But we were all sort of out front, and Russ would always store the new barrels for the year out on the open crush pad, and Miguel's sort of looking around, and he sees a little sawdust, and tells me to come look at it. We start picking up these barrels, and there's dust everywhere, sawdust everywhere. Turns out beetles had attacked the barrels, and so he had all his new barrels out there, and all the empties were out there, and we start going through and everything. I mean, they loved the new barrels, but they were attacking the used barrels. I just had an old big wood fermenter I bought from Bonnie Doon, had just arrived. That's sitting out there. And the next day, getting ready to sign a huge debt. So that was not a fun day. I'm panicking, talking, calling, emailing the barrel broker. I wound up emailing an entomologist at OSU. All my colleagues, no one really knows. The entomologist says, well, the best thing to do is, take all the affected wood, burn it away from the building and start over. And okay, well, that's not a possibility. So someone tipped me off that maybe grain alcohol would work. So we started sort of spraying all the barrels with grain alcohol, and it looked like it was killing these little beetles. They would sort of come out of the hole and then die. But then it turned out 5 minutes later, so they would spring back to life. So they'd passed out from the alcohol. So we figured out that didn't work. So I wound up making a big concentrated mix of SO2 and citric, what we sort of use for sanitation, spraying the barrels, and then we would go through with a toothpick or a needle and poke out all the barrels. We called everyone in, we went through all the barrels, got them into the warehouse, shoved, crammed, once we thought they were clean. And that was a whole day. Sort of dusk's coming, and we're finally done. Everyone's really tired, and we see this sort of swarm of beetles coming down from the trees, and they were descending. And sure enough, they were back, but we had everything put aside. Russ had never seen anything like this before. He'd been storing his barrels out there for 20 some odd years. Nothing like this had happened. I'm still thinking, okay, am I going to come in tomorrow morning and, all the barrels in the winery are going to have holes in them and all of our wine has gone down the drain. That didn't happen. Beetles never got into the winery. We have, well, you can see around here, we still have a lot of plugged barrels, the holes from that year of the beetles. We now store all of the barrels inside, have a lot more space, so it's a lot easier. But
that's really bad symbolism for buying a winery.
Yeah. Yeah, it was sort of the start of a rough 6 months. We had all, we'd harvest looming, had all sort of silly paperwork, TTB sort of stuff going on, while on my shoulders I'd had this immense pressure of, while I'd been here for many years and done it all, now it was me. And, the reason I sort of agreed to take it over was to preserve it. And if I screwed it up, that was going to be a pretty clear failure. So it was, there was a crazy harvest. And then 10 was the year of the birds. So right after the beetles, we had the birds sort of descend. Again, nothing that Russ had ever seen before. His bird control before was a sort of half-broken shotgun he'd go out and shoot every now and then to scare him. But we had just, the sky would almost turn black with these thousands of starlings just descending on the vineyard. And it wasn't just us, it was the whole valley was affected that year. And, we were pretty lucky in that small 13-acre vineyard, real nice gentle slope. I can stand up at the top and see the whole vineyard. And so I had propane cannons out and shotguns. And what I found worked the best actually was an air horn. That kind of would spook them up like a shotgun, but then once I got them up in the air, I could keep moving them with pulses of the air horn, so not just get them up off the vines, but move them out off the vineyard. So it worked, but I would spend most of the day riding around like a crazy person in the old Ford with an air horn, getting these birds to stop eating our grapes. And we did. We barely lost anything. We were really fortunate. There was a lot of vineyards lost a lot of fruit that year, and I know like larger vineyards were letting whole blocks go. Ken Kinsella, where I was at that point getting fruit from, actually in 2008, he cut out some fruit for me, and I still make wine from his vineyard. But he had a lot of loss that year. So it was a challenging harvest, but we made it, and still one of my favorite vintages. Beautiful balance we got in those wines. Definitely was hard fought, but we won. The next couple years were a bit like that. It wasn't as intense as that, but I was definitely carrying a self-imposed pressure to not screw this place up. It was real easy. My philosophy was so aligned with Russ, and making the style of wines I wanted to. I was growing grapes the way I wanted to, but it was it was a lot of pressure I put on myself. And it also felt like, this was their place. This was Russ and Mary's. They started, in '86, planting the vines here, living in a trailer out in the middle of the vineyard for 5 years. They put a ton of work, sweat, their hearts into it, to let that not succeed was sort of not an option. But after 4 years or so, sort of started to take on a different feel, and it started to feel more like our place rather than theirs. And while there was really no difference in the wines or the vineyard, I did start to look at our property here more as a farm, not just a vineyard and a winery. And that really made a lot of sense to me and my wife, and also in turn started making it feel like ours. While Russ and Mary are still such a part of this place, it's I guess in a way I don't feel like a visitor anymore, which I did for a long time. So it's really it's fallen into place nicely, and I still have Haden Fig as my own sort of place to play. I joke that I steal grapes from Le Puisac, our state vineyard here at Evesham, every now and then for Haden Fig to. This past year we did a skin contact Pinot Gris and Gewurz from the original plantings in '86. Made a really interesting rosé, and that first time I started doing a Gris skin contact was in 2011, and Russ came over harvest. He's just stopping by to say hi, and I'm sort of out front punching down some Pinot Gris, and he just looks at me like I'm crazy, and don't worry, Russ. This is for Haden Fig. It's not Evesham, but it still has that. Evesham is. My goal still is to keep it as it has been, and the few changes I have made is bringing back some old bottlings. Like we have a great old block up at Temperance Hill from 1982, and Russ been working with that for decades before I came, and but he hadn't bottled any of it separately in about 10 or 12 years. And so one of the things I wanted to do was bring back that bottling, capture some of Temperance Hill separately. He was blending it into our Yosemite Hills cuvee. And same thing with Mahonia Vineyard, the long history there, almost from the very beginning. And used to do vineyard designates, but had stopped for a long time, and so brought that back. We're doing bottlings there. We've now taken over the whole vineyard, and now we're farming it ourselves. We're farming it organically, and so really sort of feels like our sort of second estate vineyard. And while it's a change, it's also a change going back to the origin of Evesham.
That covered a lot.
Yeah.
I want to back up for a second before Oregon, actually.
Yeah.
You mentioned kind of falling for wine pretty quickly when you were doing kind of culinary work and getting into retail. Tell me about your impressions of Oregon wine from the retail distribution side before you got here, and then maybe how those impressions were confirmed or changed once you actually got to Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't have an old world palate, and you know, that was a big part of what I loved about retail was, you know, tasting 100 wines a week from all over the world, but mostly, you know, a lot of old world. We had great old world importers there, and Willamette Valley Pinots really had that similarity there, that liveliness, that acidity, and that stuck out to me. I can still, as I'm saying this, I can still see bottles up on the shelf there, which was, you know, mid-90s. And so that didn't really, you know, that wasn't a wow moment. You know, I never in the wildest dreams would have thought I'd be making wine then. But as it got closer and closer to that of actually, I'm going to be making this stuff, not just, you know, tasting it and selling it, there was no other option in the U.S. for me. That was pretty crystal clear, and one of the few times in my life things have been so clear. And it sort of felt like when my wife and I, when we were in Berkeley, it was, man, I kind of know my calling here. This is really weird. I'd never had anything remotely like that in my life. I kind of know what I'm supposed to do, but my wife doesn't want to go live in that area. And so while I was in California, it was, in a way, frustrating is not the right word, but I was sort of blindly doing it, and I knew the studies and the learning, and I just knew I wasn't going to have the passion to make wine there. And so I was going through this sort of training and learning without really knowing. I knew what I wanted that end to be, but that didn't seem like that was going to be possible. And so I actually started looking at, start seriously looking at New Zealand, a possibility of making Pinot Noir there. Nelson area I was really drawn to. And we'd actually booked a trip there. We were going to kind of half vacation, half explore wine regions when we were in Berkeley and think, try it on. Would this be sunny enough for my wife? And would I be able to make sort of wines in the style that I was drawn to there? And were happenstance, I was taking a chemistry class as part of my studies there. And I had a final, and then we were going to leave the next day on this trip. And our dog, my wife's dog she got in college, actually, when she lived in a dorm room as a puppy, she would smuggle this dog into her dorm room. In the middle of night, started having these wild seizures, and so this was our baby then, and it was, you know, a sleepless night, and off to the vet. I groggily walk into this chemistry exam. Didn't do well on that at all. My professor's sort of looking at me like, what is wrong with you? But so we canceled the New Zealand trip. We figured, we can't leave now. This is, this is too touch and go with our dog. So Vegas, and then the rain came, and eyes opened that Willamette Valley might work. So. I think I answered half of that question. I can't remember what the other half
I'm
was.
curious, when you got here, was it what you expected?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was, yeah, it was super special. I mean, it was, I guess I kind of expected it, but to the degree that I was welcomed and taken under people's wings and helped other winemakers, growers. It was surprising how welcoming it was. You know, in any other industry, these are, you know, your quote-unquote competition. Here they would do anything to help you out. And it was, yeah, super supportive. And yeah, a lot, I mean, certainly more than just Russ and Mary and Ken Kinsella, I mean, John Groschow early on. I mean, there are a lot of people, Jay Summers, that really just, yeah, were supportive and helpful any way they could be. And maybe your next question would be, has it changed? And, you know, yeah, I guess it has changed. Everything does. But to me, it's sort of, there's a bit more of a divide where I didn't notice that, at least, and I don't think it really was there when I first got here in '07. But it's definitely, if it was there, it's stronger now, and that there's still that super tight, welcoming community here, and it's just as big, if not bigger, than it was then. But there's definitely another side to the valley now. You know, corporate was something that word didn't exist in the Willamette Valley when I came here, and you know, that's certainly part of our culture here now. So I think, you know, that's not my style, but I think there's plenty of the sort of the old guard and the new guys looking to the old guard, that really, you know, that I would put myself in, that really value that part of the valley and work hard to keep it that way, at least a part of it.
So you mentioned meeting Russ and kind of finding a kindred spirit in terms of wine philosophy. So tell me about how you would describe your winemaking philosophy and how maybe Russ, it changed after meeting Russ.
Yeah, so I mentioned, you know, in Napa, I've sort of learned everything you could possibly do to a wine. And when I came here that first harvest, which, you know, with Napa, I didn't subscribe to that. I, you know, definitely was happy to go up against that. But then when I came here with Russ, it was to a whole other level. You know, that first vintage in 2007, I had just a couple of fermenters of my own wine. This is my first solo wine. I was quite nervous, did not want to screw this up. And so I'm, you know, tending to my fermenters every morning and every evening. I'm, you know, checking the temperature, Brix levels, watching the fermentation curve. Then Russ would sort of look at me funny when I was doing this, and they would comment, but and that was the first and last time I ever did that. You know, I really learned from Russ. I guess the biggest thing I learned from Russ is to not do anything, you know, and while that seems simple, it's really hard to fight that instinct, especially when you're nervous about something or unsure. And I would often, you know, come over with a sample from the warehouse. Russ, taste this, what do you think? And he's like, oh, that's fine, you know, don't worry about it. And almost all the time, wines, they work themselves out. Not every time, but almost all the time, and they make, I think, a much better wine than there ever could be. And so it took a long time for me to fight that instinct of, I wouldn't do it, but I'd be really angsted inside about it, and distressed. And now it's not at all. I mean, it's sort of this flow. I mean, even, in our vineyard, we're not taking petiole samples and pressure bombs, and we're walking the vines, looking at the leaves, we're just looking. And in the cellar, we're looking, we're tasting, we're smelling, and that's our monitoring, and that is not, it wasn't something Russ taught me. It was something I learned from observing him. And part of it for him, it was, there was no angst there on his part, and he would even go to bottle without checking SO2 levels. I still can't do that. I'm not easy with that. I want to know what's in there before we put the cork in, but that's essentially the only time we ever go to a lab. It's really using our senses, and that's, monitoring our fermenters is smelling, looking, touching, and that's how we farm the vineyard too. Russ, super early on into farming organically. He had Le Puisec certified organic in 2002. Very much ahead of his time there, very much ahead of his time dry farming. He and John Paul started the DRC back who knows when, one of those heavily wine nights. But looking to the old world, and Russ very much into organics, John Paul biodynamics, but looking at these two certifications or ways of farming in the new world, and neither of them addressed irrigation. Whereas you look to the old world, where we, all of us get our inspiration and enjoyment from, and it's illegal to irrigate if you want to put the AOC on your label. So, you look at that now and it's like, of course. But then that was so progressive. Non-filtering Pinot Noir. I mean, Russ, I remember him telling me, it was Barney Watson. He was checking with him, early 90s probably. I'm thinking about not filtering. What do you think? Oh, you're crazy. That wine's going to be so unstable. Now quite common, unfiltered wines, and we still rack out of the racking bung, traditional method, and for Russ it was just sort of obvious. I think for me it's a little more calculated, and more of a conscious effort to slow down, to move back, to not rely or embrace technology just because it's available.
You talked a little bit about that sort of the confidence level, the angst level at letting things be.
Yeah.
Was there a moment for you or a vintage for you that confidence kind of kicked in, where you felt like what you were doing to the grapes in the vineyard and to the wine, that it was good enough that you could just let it be? Like, at what point do you feel like, I'm doing this right, I gotta trust the process?
No, it was definitely just a gradual. I guess at least we get to 09 vintage, those wines, from the beginning, I was happy, with what I'd made. So by the time I had taken over at Evesham, there wasn't like, I guess I didn't feel like I was doing anything wrong or needed to do anything differently. but the potential was the scary part. And you know, even while I sort of knew logically, go with the flow, you know, let those vines, let that wine lead you. Just to let it go was hard. And so, yeah, I mean, 2010, you know, those wines I was really happy with early on. Didn't make 2011s any less stressful. Just because it worked once didn't mean I couldn't still screw it up. And so I think it was, and I think probably that was part of where Russ's philosophy or ease came from, of just time and history and experience. And you know, you see it happen enough times, okay, you're probably not going to screw it up. So it just sort of eased in. It definitely wasn't a light bulb moment for me.
Talk a little bit about Haden Fig and about starting it really, really quickly in your wine journey here. As it's evolved as a brand, what is it that you look to it for now? You mentioned kind of experimentation and doing things that made Russ shake his head at you, but I'm curious, as it's evolved, what do you do differently with Haden Fig?
Well, you know, that was, taking over Evesham, keeping Haden Fig going. These were not, part of a grand marketing scheme. And if we did have a PR company, they would definitely tell us to do things completely differently. It was, so when I started making Haden Fig and when I still make it now, those wines, there's not a big difference between Evesham, because my philosophy with Russ is so similar. And so it wasn't like, oh, this is your second label, this is your experimentation, it's different. And so, there's little things I do in the cellar. Definitely play around a lot more with different vineyards with Haden Fig. Evesham to me is very much about our estate, Le Puisac and the Yosemite Hills. And while that's, definitely my favorite growing region and my favorite vineyard, I do play around with the wrong word. I do like to experience different things. And even early on with Haden Fig, when I was looking for land, I sort of quickly realized, gosh, I don't want to, set myself up if I have too large of a piece of land that I'm going to, be sort of stuck just working with this fruit. Mm-hmm. I really love to work with these different sites, and we work with at least a dozen different vineyards every year, and you can have one vineyard right next to the other that express themselves completely differently. We have Le Puisac here, which is Jory Nikaya soil. It's own-rooted Pommard from 86. Our block up at Temperance Hill, 5 miles away, is own-rooted Pommard from 82 on Jory Nikaya soil. Treat them exactly the same, and the wines are completely different wines. That's part of what drew me to the Valley. That's part of what drew me to Pinot Noir. And so I guess, Haden Fig does open that up a bit more. And who knows, but now we're not doing anything crazy. Definitely have a much more, a big focus on Chardonnay for Haden Fig. We have for a number of years. Not to say that Russ wasn't with Evesham, but actually in the mid-2000s, Russ grafted over a few acres of Chardonnay here at Le Puisac to Pinot because the Pinot was flying and he actually had to work to sell that Chardonnay. He still left a quarter of acre. We have a quarter acre right up the top of the vineyard where we get a barrel or two a year out of, which again, PR company, accountants would, hate that. But, we love to make that one barrel of Le Puisec Chardonnay. And so I started, Haden Fig started, obviously, it's about the wine. But in '08, I had wine bottled. And my wife and I, we had our first son. And we had no name for the winery, and we had no name for baby Nuccio. And so it was actually the same week, sleep deprived of having a newborn, we named Haden and Haden Fig. Then a few years later had our daughter Juliet, which is now our sort of reserve level under the Haden Fig wines to try and even out the sibling rivalry. Yeah.
You talked earlier about obviously feeling a pretty immense pressure, putting pressure on yourself, especially taking over Evesham Wood. I'm curious, as you're taking over this brand from a person you really respect, and the brand is very respected also. As that pressure kind of decreases, how do you evolve that? How do you take the brand Evesham Wood and make it yours while still keeping it in kind of the spirit that it's always been?
I guess there's no change. It's just an internal feeling change. This place is the same. It's a little different. We've got horses and chickens and ducks, and we expanded our caves, but it's the same. It's just sort of the perspective I look through that has changed, and it does. As I said earlier, I don't feel like a visitor anymore, but that's not because Evesham or Le Puisec has changed. It's because I have my perspective of it, and so the goals are still exactly the same. Don't screw it up. I have more confidence now that I'm not going to screw it up. That's not going to get screwed up, which definitely, my wife would say probably makes me a friendlier person. But harvests are a lot less stressful now, and we're not doing anything different. I've got amazing crew of the Torres family, who mentioned earlier, Miguel and Fredo and Isaro. Their mom and dad still help out every now and then. Miguel's daughter Brenda now helps out. So we had 3 generations. And it's basically them, myself, and now we're open to the public. For a few years we've been. So we have Chris over running the tasting room, but it's just us. And it's all the same. It's just more time together and more time here, feeling more at home.
Talk about selling wines. Usually the biggest complaint people have about being in the wine business is actually having to sell the product when they're done with it. You have a background in retail and in distribution. Obviously, you took over a brand that's highly respected. Tell me about selling Evesham Wood wine, selling Haden Fig wine, and how it's maybe changed since you started.
Yeah, I loved selling wine. In retail, I loved that exposure to wines from all over the world and tasting all of them, which is still probably what I look back to the most when making wine, is those early years of developing a palate from wines all over the world. But I also loved maybe equally selling them and opening people up to new wines, and so I guess it's a bit of a different perspective than many coming from that, but to then go sell, or much more my way of looking at it is share these wines with people, and now it's wines that I actually made. It was great. I think maybe my wife is my worst critic, but if not, it's me. And so, that pressure, that pressure comes way before, when I'm making these wines. And so when they're in the bottle, I'm pretty happy with them, and so it's definitely much more an enjoyment of sharing them with other people. And the wines we make are not for everyone. And this style of restraint is not what everyone's looking for, and that's totally cool. I say that Temperance Hill, that the wine we make from there, I call it the love it or hate it wine. It's it's not for everyone, and I've got distributors, other winemakers that similar palates to mine. Half of them, it's their favorite vineyard in the valley. Half of them, you can't stand it, and I think that's great. The one thing I argue about with anyone is if they don't agree it's a distinct site. You can dislike it, but man, that site produces a really distinct wine. And that's what I loved about it when I first got into the business. It's endless. There's so many. So many differences. Now I deal mostly with one grape or a few grapes, a handful of grapes, but a dozen vineyards, and then a vintage. Every vintage here is completely different, and I very much want the wines to reflect that. And from a sort of typical selling point, that could be a problem. Evesham Woods, even our introductory Willamette Valley Pinot blend of many different vineyards, excuse me, is completely different every year. And so, you go pick up 2017 Evesham Willamette Valley Pinot, and then you try the 18. Those are completely different wines, and it's because of the growing season. And I really try to embrace that. When I was in California, I helped out at a vineyard in Napa up on Howell Mountain. It was another really interesting experience. Winemaker there, great guy, and I should have joked. He would make. His day job was making Howell Mountain Cabernet, 98-point Robert Parker wines, and then his side job was making Pinot Noirs, 95-point Robert Parker wines, super successful, really good guy. And he would give me a hard time. He's like, "Oh, Erin, you're going up to the Willamette Valley. You can grow good wine up there, but every vintage is so different." And that was seen really as a negative to him. And to me, it's such a positive. It's part of what keeps it fun. It's part of what it is. So much of this is out of our control, and to embrace that is definitely a big part of it. And I think that it's part of the same thing with what I've learned from Russ is you're not in control of this stuff, and there's things you can do, but only so much. And but most of the time it works, and if not, there's the woods in the back.
So we're talking in the end of June of 2020 here, or dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's affected, of course, the wine industry as well as everything else. So tell me how it's changed things for you, if at all, in the last few months, and sort of if it's what your outlook is going forward at this point.
I have no idea on the latter. It hasn't changed things much for us, at least looking at it now, maybe if I look back at this in 10 years, I'll be able to pinpoint. But you know, the sort of business side of things is different but the same. You know, I think you know, certainly with restaurant closure, there's been a huge shakeup there, and you know, it's a shame what that industry is dealing with it, and how they're going to come out of that is scary. But for me, and this sort of back a step, we don't see a big difference there. You know, we have a tasting room here now, and the hospitality signs of things have changed, but you know, at least for us, we were not. I always hoped we were not, and I don't think we were, just sort of, you know, a stop on the road of many. We were, you know, for the most part, people that came to see us for a reason. And so, you know, we closed down for, I don't know, a month or two and opened back up. We're mostly by appointment. But that's a lot of what we were doing before anyways. You know, yeah, and so long term, or I don't know, what I have no idea what things are going to look like in a year. I wouldn't be surprised if things are turned upside down, and I also wouldn't be surprised if we're back to some sort of normal. And, you know, I guess it kind of ties into all of it, is it's out of our control, and do the best we can, yeah, to go along.
So as you look ahead for yourself then, pandemic notwithstanding, what are you kind of looking for the next decade at Evesham Wood, at Haden Fig, for yourself personally?
You know, I used to joke, and my wife would probably have a more, you know, negative way of putting it, but I do things slowly. I make change slowly, baby steps, and you know, that's probably part of a continuum of how this has all gone. And so, you know, it's been 10 years since I took over Evesham, and I guess if I look back at how it was then and how it is now, you could see some change, but it's more of just a continuation. You know, what would it have looked like if, you know, if Russ had stayed here? Probably not much different. And that was the goal. That's what I wanted to do, you know, and that was, you know, that was my fear, and I think probably some of Russ and Mary's, is that, you know, letting go of it, there was potential for, you know, them to walk in here and 2 years later not recognize it. And that was, you know, it's really important to me that that didn't happen. And it wasn't hard for me to do that because I love this place and I wanted to keep it. But, you know, in that move of it feeling more hours, and definitely, you know, we're definitely going more towards a farm than a vineyard and a winery. I've had a couple failed attempts at chickens in the rows, and so I'd love to figure that out in the next 10 years. And who knows, the caves might go a little farther into the woods. But yeah, I don't want to see it much different.
You talked earlier about one of the changes you've seen in the industry in terms of the added corporate side of Oregon wine. What other changes have you seen since you became a part of the industry? What does it look like now versus what it looked like when you started?
I'd say there's not much apart from that. There's, you know, we've seen our Deep Roots Coalition. That has grown immensely. We were, you know, well over 30 wineries now, and that was, in 2010, that was, was loosey-goosey to say the least. And so, getting more structure in this unstructured organization, I remember John Paul and Russ would say, the way they got David Lett to join was to promise them there would never be a meeting in the organization's history. And, we have meetings now. And it's definitely attracted people and grown, and there's a real interest in that, that's grown. And so, there's a change there, and kind of in tandem with, there weren't private jets flying in and out of here when I came here. And there's, not a lot, but there's, there are those changes, and I think that's sort of just building up both sides, not sweeping across the valley into a big change. There's more and more vineyards being planted, more and more wineries, but even in the Yosemite Hills, sub-AVA here, there's just, there's still tons of wonderful sites that haven't been planted yet. So the room for growth is, it's immense, and we're still just scratching this. Come back in 100 years, and I think you'd see some change then. But I don't know if we'd still be fully planted then yet. So there's a lot of room, and there's a lot of people. There's enough, I think, that are really admire where it started and want to hold on to that. Not at any costs, but you can change and still hold on to those roots, not as memories, but as every day.
So as you look ahead then for Oregon wine, what do you see it looking like 10 years from now? Will it have grown? Will it have changed in other ways? What do you kind of see on the horizon, and maybe what do you fear on the horizon?
I mean, growth, that would shock me. I guess that would be the surprise if we didn't see a lot more wineries and a lot more vineyards and a lot more attention. And my guess would be that, we would see similar growth the way it's going now. We'll get some bigger wineries, we'll get some corporate impact, but we're going to have strong growth of, small wineries that are, still very hands-on. And, there's a lot of us that are sort of, in a way, sort of going backwards. And, just because you can do something doesn't mean it's the best thing to do. As far as, I don't know, predictions. I would still think Pinot Noir would still definitely be the highest planted varietal, but I don't know.
You talked about the mentors you had getting into the industry and all the people who took you under their wing and offered you advice. I'm sure you have been on the other end of that now and had people come to you for advice. So I'm curious, if someone comes to you and wants to be in the Oregon wine industry, what are your words of wisdom?
Well, I remember, it makes me think of what Russ was said to me early on. He was maybe, I guess he was apprehensive about encouraging me to get into the Willamette Valley wine industry. He certainly didn't discourage me, but he was sort of blown away by the number of wineries there were then compared to when he started. And he thought, are there enough outlets for all this wine? And 10 years later, or 13 years later, I think the answer is clearly yes. So while our production has grown here, the interest in the outlets has grown just as quickly. We used to, when I took over Evesham in 10, we used to stand out a bit more as the style of wine we would make, the restraint, and our clientele was pretty small but pretty devoted. Mm-hmm. And I've definitely seen that change as, the number of people embracing this style of wine has definitely grown. Grown both in number and percentage of sort of the market. But I've also seen the number of wineries producing this style of wine grown. Mm-hmm. When I came here in 2007, the joke in the valley was when Russ starts picking, it means harvest is going to start in 2 weeks. Everyone would call him an early picker. He was, often, the first to pick. And that's not the case anymore. And when I took over in 10, that was the case. Shared vineyards, I was always the first to start picking. That's not the case anymore. There's a lot of sites I share where, there's a cluster of us that will start picking at the same time. I mean, I call it picking on time, not picking early. Looking to capture that acid and freshness. And there still are some vineyards where I'll be the first to start picking by weeks sometimes. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely, it's not like we've fully swung over, but that's grown, which, I guess in one way you could say we have more quote unquote competition now. But it's the valley, so it doesn't feel that way at all. There's more wines I love to drink coming from the valley, and which is it's just a great thing. And I don't think we're going to swing all the way over by any means. I think I don't really want to get into it, but I think the natural wine movement plays into that too, and the parkerization and the change in that, and the the style of wines ebbs and flows. I think that'll stay. That's the one thing we know that's not going to change, is that things are going to change.
All right, last question for you. We got a little philosophical for you to finish this up.
Okay.
What is wine's role in society?
Oof. I think the way I would answer that is the way I look at what I'm doing. What I'm trying to do is capture where this was grown and when this was grown. And that's what's most important to me. And I think staying true to that is what I want to do. And that, I definitely don't think you could put that into all of society. And so I don't think there is one answer to that. I don't think there is one role or one answer to what wine's role in society is. For me, it's it's important to farm a piece of land responsibly, and it's important to capture that vintage and that site and share it. One of my favorite wines to make is the Evesham Wood Willamette Valley Pinot. This is our largest production wine by far and our least expensive. And it's a wine that reflects the vintage it was grown in and where it was grown. And it's a wine that most can afford to experience. It's a wine that you can watch evolve over a decade and experience that. And it's a wine that hopefully, doesn't sit in somebody's cellar as a trophy. It's a wine that people get to experience. And that's why I want to make wine, is for people to experience it. And so, for me, there's definitely an internal fight there of, we've got to be sustainable. We've got to be able to pay the bills and pay our employees, and comfortably. But I also don't want this to be exclusive, and certainly, don't want to make a bottle of wine that sits and gets pet for the next 2 decades rather than enjoyed. Yeah.
All right, that's all the questions I have for you.
Okay.
Anything I didn't ask that I should have asked? Is there anything we didn't cover that we should have covered?
Not that I can think of.
It's great. Thank you so much for this, for the great stories, for your perspectives, and go ahead and let you off the hook.
Cool. Thanks.